Hi guys, my name is Holly, and today I'm going to be analyzing the Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. More specifically, since this book is comprised of multiple short stories, I'm going to be analyzing the one titled The Shore from August 2002. And I thought it was worth mentioning that The Shore is about this long, so I'm just going to be analyzing the entirety of it. So, the theme that I've identified in this passage would have to be colonization and American expansionism. Another idea that I'm going to be discussing is the exclusion of other cultures in space exploration. It highlights how the first settlers on Mars were isolated and rugged men, followed by a second wave of Americans while the rest of the world was left behind due to a war. The issue and question being raised in this passage is who gets to claim new frontiers and explore them, of course, which reflects the historical patterns of colonization that we'll be discussing. So this is where the text supports my point. So on page 114, the author says, "The first wave carried with it men accustomed to spaces and coldness and being alone, the coyote and cattlemen, with no fat on them, with faces the years had worn the flesh off, like nail heads, and hands like the material of old gloves, ready to touch anything." So from what the author is saying, we get this image in our mind that the first settlers are men who are hardened and accustomed to almost a refugee-like lifestyle. They're self-sufficient in a way when the author says that they're accustomed to being alone and being in spaces with coldness. Their toughness is also emphasized with the imagery, faces the years had worn the flesh off like nail heads. And the phrase, ready to touch anything, suggests a pioneering spirit, but also one that ignores the consequences of colonization that we see so often repeated over history. The term American is also very repeated within this passage, so we just discussed the first wave, but in the second wave, American is repeated an incredible amount. So the repetition in this passage signals to how space colonization was so exclusive to one nation, and we see that often repeated in history. This is where my perspective was challenged because, in my mind, with space colonization, it makes the most sense to combine powers and tackle that all together in order to gain more success and combine technologies, etc. But rather than that, Americans only had the opportunity to settle Mars, which, yet again, the other countries were being excluded, as the passage mentions that they're, I think, buried in thoughts of war or in war entirely. Overall, this quote means to me how that space exploration is directly tied to wealth, power, and is an opportunity not many countries held at the time, and a privilege for America. So when discussing exploration and who gets to settle in which frontiers, it's essential to look back on the world's history of colonization and the historical background. As we've learned from the past, it will always be the powerful nations that will conquer and exclude other lesser nations when settling. So as you can see here, I know the picture is kind of small, but the blue represents Europe, and then it just goes further down in shade of which has been under European control, and I think it's very telling. The purpose of this map is to show you how great the influence of Europe was at one point and just how many countries they were able to colonize with their power. This brings me to my perspective on the topic and what greater thoughts that I've had since reading this passage. It definitely reminds me of European colonization of the Americas, and I think it's pretty interesting how this image is titled An Interview with the natives and the pilgrims, because I do not think, as we learn, that this is extremely historically accurate. As we know now, America has come to more truthful historical terms on how the Americas were colonized, and that came with a lot of violence and war. I feel like what Bradbury might be trying to get at is that this might be very similar to how Europeans took the Americas with force and exploited the natives at the time, and that he's saying space colonization might have taken a similar path. Especially with describing the men in the beginning with the first quote that I analyzed, saying that they're hard, rugged men. They kind of have this take what you can get mentality, and that's very similar to what the Europeans at the time kind of followed. In the space exploration, they're willing to take whatever Mars offers, which mirrors how the Europeans saw the New World as something to conquer and rather than to coexist with. So, reading this passage definitely challenged my previous views, as I have always believed that if we had combined all of our resources as a globe, that we would be stronger and come together united, but that is not the case. I think the moral of the story is to show how, in cases like space exploration, it can benefit a few as well as colonization, but leave others far behind. Thank you.